Hello and welcome to this conversation on Bloomberg Quint. India Transformed 25 Years of Economic Reform is a compilation of articles from the who's who of Indian business and Indian economy. Edited by Dr. Rakesh Mohan, the book is perhaps a testament to the fact that 1991 remains one of the most important or the most important turning point in the Indian economy. It's a pleasure to have Dr. Rakesh Mohan with us here. Dr. Mohan, thank you so much for taking the time. Dr. Mohan, seriously a testament, right? I mean, you've got the who's who of business, probably people who don't have more than 5 minutes to spare on any writing. Good experience putting this together?
Oh, absolutely. A key objective of compiling this book was to reflect that, look, 25 years have gone by of what I would call almost continuous economic reforms over this whole period. And as we thought of this last year, that we should do this, one thought that occurred to me was that people who are under the age of 40 like yourself have really no idea of what the country was like before 1991. So, and given that the vast majority of the country now is under the age of 40, that it is very useful, I think, to document what happened, how it happened, and how this process has been a continuous one over this long period of time. And also to, in some sense, suggest that, look, if we were able to do this in the last 25 years and increase the growth rate from, say, 5.5 in the 80s, 3.5 in the previous 30 years, 1950 to 1980, to something like 6.5, 7.5 average in the 90s and 2000s till now in the last 25 years, we can have greater aspirations the next 25 years. That if we could do all these very significant changes last 25 years, why not similar significant changes over the next 25 years, so that we can go up to an aspirational rate of 8 to 10% growth over the next 25 years. So in doing this, the idea was, let's get people who were active in policy making, who can relate what they did, how things were done. Let's get some analysts who have been observing this unfolding events, and almost most importantly, get a group of businessmen who in some sense were recipients of the policy and in a way kind of got hold of the ball and ran with it. So we have a group of really successful, inspirational businessmen who did take the time out to write these chapters. And I have to tell you that I was quite amazed that all the 31 authors that you have here agreed immediately. Of course, I did have to push them a bit after they agreed. And I did boomerang each chapter at least 3 times to get to where I wanted them to be.
We all recognize that a lot was done, but can you, for the sake of our viewers, talk a little bit about those 3 things that you highlight that were not done, including industrial restructuring, which then I'll try and link it back to what's happening today.
Okay, so as the 91 reforms were done, what were we doing? We were, through all the deregulation, that is delicensing, etc., that I just talked about, what we were doing was, in concept, increasing domestic competition from a situation where people used to have to get government permission to start an industry. That is all taken away, so that we would expect more competition to come in, new people will come in every sector. Second, we started the process of opening of trade, so that there would be competition from imported products. Third, we opened up foreign direct investment, which was essentially closed prior to 1991, another source of competition. Fourth, we opened up the public sector, that is, many industries that reserved the public sector prior to 1991 were opened up. So the thinking in some sense was, in the then Ministry of Industry, that look, we are doing all these things, so there's bound to be some disruption. As a consequence, tariffs coming down, imports coming in, and all the new domestic and foreign competition. And therefore, we need to prepare the wherewithal in some sense to cope with the disruption that will take place. Another issue that was in our minds was that unlike East and Southeast Asia, which specialized in labor intensive manufacturing, we had not. And partly because of the kind of tariff structure that we'd had, that by doing the trade reform and the new competition, etc., we had assumed that we would be moving towards greater labor using or labor-intensive manufacturing. But that hasn't happened. But to do that, what also in our minds was that if for that to happen, small-scale industry reservations would have to go, and also labor reform would have to be done. Now, the small-scale industry reservations actually didn't take place in the 90s. They took place much later, and in fact, the last item of small-scale industry reservation was taken off just last year. There were 836 items reserved in 1991. And then so the issue in some sense in our minds was one, that we want to make it easier for industries get into difficulty because of these policy measures to modernize, and if labor has to be restructured, has to be redeployed, etc., that should become easier. And therefore, we had devised the National Renewal Fund. We had designed the National Renewal Fund from the Ministry of Industry, and actually it got approval of the cabinet in 1994, if my memory serves me. I think it was 1994 when it was approved. But for various things happened, it was never implemented. We actually got a World Bank loan as well to do that, but somehow we just never managed to implement that. The content of that was that we would set up what we call the National Renewal Fund from budgetary sources, and that's what we got the World Bank loan for. And from that National Renewal Fund, it would be used to that industries that would be restructured, the labor involved in those industries would be able to get golden handshakes from this fund. Oh. Second, what we had planned was, that was a temporary measure in some sense. Second, what we had planned was that we should set up what we called, I think, unemployment insurance fund, I'm sorry, it was I think called insurance fund for employees. I think it was called, because we didn't want to mention unemployment. And so what we had calculated was that if you contribute about 4% of wages of the organized sector into such a fund, and you can take the 4% whichever way you like, in terms of say 1% from employees, wages 1% from the employer, 2% from the government, to any other combination of that 4%. And what we calculated was that if you set up such a fund forever, then for something like 6 or 7 years, I've now forgotten the exact number of years, that you keep accumulating that money, no payout from that, because you already set up the National Renewal Fund to do the payout temporarily during that period. So by the end of say 7 years, you'll have enough of a corpus that it will, and you continue this 4% of all wages to go into the fund. You have a fund forever. After you've done the initial 7 years of budgetary resources coming in to take care of the employees, so that there would be essentially unemployment insurance for some period of time for any members, any workers who are restructured because of their company either going out of business or because they are downsizing or whatever. Second, the fund was, we'd also worked actually with a number of industry associations to start setting up retraining centers, so that a fund which would, workers who would get restructured, would get laid off or restructured, can then be retrained in an organized fashion.
And absorbed into another industry.
And absorbed into another industry, you get retrained for whatever it is, and we are working with industry to do that. Third, we actually had detailed discussions with the number of unions. And one of the interesting aspects was that some of the unions said that, look, it's not a good idea to give lump sums to our workers, because they then get lots of demands from extended family if you get a lump sum. So what we would like is for them to get an annuity. So we actually worked with some financial institutions also to set that up, that if you get a lump sum, it goes immediately off into something that gives you an annuity. It's a very long answer to a short question.
It's a fascinating answer.
Yeah, but I think this still needs to be done. Right?
Yeah, I was just going to ask you. So this
still needs to be done.
It still certainly seems like a concept. It's very relevant even today.
And my personal view, if I may give it, my personal view is that if we had done that in the mid-1990s, because all the work had been done, we could have also done the labor reform, which has still not been done.
And that remains a constraint, the labor reform, and I guess the precursor would have to be some sort of social security net.
Exactly. So that was the point, that look, we can't expect labor to say, yes, thank you very much.
We're happy to get fired.
We have to get fired. You have to provide some backstop. Yes, we understand that the organized sector labor in any case is better off than the unorganized sector, but nonetheless, I think these mechanisms are very feasible. So we assure the labor, look, your interests are being looked after. If the other issues, we can discuss them, but we need to now go ahead. The country needs to have industries which generate far more employment in the future, and therefore we have to do these things. I think it's very, very feasible still to do it. That's what we should do now.
Why do you, we've asked this question for so many years, but we just have not been able to move on labor reforms in any way. Do you think that is continues to be a constraint on growth in the industrial part of the economy? We've relied on services for a very, very long time.
I think it is a constraint for investment in labor intensive industries. And I represented among other countries from South Asia, Bangladesh, when I was executive director in the IMF. So I had the opportunity of visiting Bangladesh, and because of some of the issues that have taken place in the garment sector, but they've been very successful in the garment export. So I visited a couple of factories there. And what is interesting is that in Dhaka, you have a whole bunch of 20, 25-story factories, buildings, which are garment factories, very modern. Obviously, I didn't see the sweatshops that also must exist in Bangladesh, but you have modern multi-floor, what you might call flatted factories, where garments are being made. You start with the cutting of the cloth at the top, which is quite high technology in terms of CAD/CAM, etc. Then you go down to the stitching areas, and then you go down to the processing areas. Then you go down to the cleaning areas, the dyeing areas, etc., with lots of people working in them. And there's a nice mix of both men and women. And in the couple of factories I visited, you also have very nice creches for the kids or the women working there. So my point is that in the case of Bangladesh, what has happened is that actually a lot of women have got empowered, young women have got empowered because they're working and they're getting their own incomes and the children are being looked after. So it does seem to me that if we do go ahead with such labor reform, you need some skilling for these activities. You need to make arrangements for the safety of workers working at nights, etc. And these are non-polluting, most of it. And you can have lots of these concentrated factories in cities, which is where you need them, for them to be productive, because garments are usually flown out actually. So anyway, I can go on this for a long time, but my point is that this is something that really needs to be done. My friend Mr. Panagaria has unfortunately decided to go back to academia. I wish he was staying because he's also been propagating these coastal economic zones for exactly activities like this. He's been advocating labor reforms ever since he came. I hope that now that he's going, there will be some other promoters of these ideas in the government. That actually something gets done.
Dr. Mohan, I don't know how directly linked it is or not, but there's a lot of sort of discomfort around the job situation in the country right now.
Well, this is the point.
It is directly linked.
That see, people kind of talk about manufacturing versus services. Yeah. Okay. Now, there's no question that the majority of jobs will come from services, but it's not enough. The proportion of people working, labor in manufacturing is too low, given our level of development. This is also connected to another issue, and this is to do with agriculture distress, that you now have about 50% of the Indian labor force dependent about less than 50%, half the labor force dependent on less than 15% of value added of GDP. And therefore, what you need to do is, for the sake of agriculture also, you need to give more opportunities for rural labor to move into non-agricultural activities, both based in rural areas as well as in urban areas. But for that, you have to really promote labor using manufacturing. And the fact is that you take all of China, you take all of Southeast Asia, Japan in the earlier part of the sort of first half of the 20th century, that's been the pattern. That's how they developed, that's how the employment moved. And so there are very high increasing levels of employment manufacturing during the development phase. Now, it's true that some of the nature of manufacturing has changed, so it won't be as labor intensive as it used to be. But nonetheless, one of the ways that I put it is that, look, if you look at Asia itself, including China, India, whole of ASEAN, Pakistan, Bangladesh, etc., that is just under 4 billion people. All the projections from the ADB, for example, suggest that this whole region of 4 billion people will be growing at 5 to 6% a year for the next 20 years. So just imagine if 4 billion people, each of them buys an extra shirt a year, each of them buys an extra pair of shoes a year, each of them buys an extra chair a year, each of them buys household goods and so on. There's no shortage of demand for the next 20 years. Forget the West. Because we keep focusing on the West now, the growth is so slow, so we've missed that. But that's not correct.
Come from us.
That's not correct. It will come from within Asia, and furthermore, that as Chinese wages are going up, and there are multiple Indian wages now, that manufacturing of this will move around. It's already moving out. It's going to Vietnam, Bangladesh, Cambodia, Philippines, etc. We should be actively getting that.
So we need to fix that as an area. Dr. Mohan, I want to take you back to your central banking years. I'm not going to say growth versus inflation because we've spoken to you all enough to know that there is no versus, but growth and inflation. So you talk about the need to move back towards at least 8% and aspire, maybe for that double-digit mark. Where do you think this growth can come back from? It's going to come from industry this time around. Have we exhausted the services lever in terms of the incremental share of growth?
Or industry, first, just some arithmetic, all right. If we want, say, 8 to 10% annual GDP growth, right, even if you do what we need to do in agriculture, it's difficult to envisage sustainable agricultural GDP growth rate at anything more than 4%. Something between 3 and 4 is realistic, can be realistic. And that is, as I suppose, that's 10 to 15% of GDP. So something else to get an average of more than 8, something else has to compensate for that, right? So both industry and services have to grow at more than 8%, nearer 10%, to be able to get an overall 8% plus GDP growth. That's just pure arithmetic. Therefore, you really need to aspire to services growth and industrial growth, both of around 10% a year at a minimum. We were doing almost that between 2003 and 2009. And to do that, we need to get back the gross investment rate up, the gross domestic investment rate up to over 35%, nearer 37, 38, 40%. Remember that China, to get 10% growth, did about 50% gross domestic investment. But I think we've been more efficient than they have been in terms of use of resources. So I think that we can get 10% growth, you have about 40% gross domestic investment. That means both public and private. It means higher investment in infrastructure, according to calculations I've done earlier in various infrastructure reports, of something like 8% of GDP in all infrastructure combined. Much higher investment in private industry, much higher investment in services, and as we've seen in the period in the 2000s, before 2009-10 or so, that it can be done. Now, it also means that you need to raise savings, because savings had gone up to about 35-36% of GDP. They've come down to about 30% now, or less. And that needs to go up again. That includes both public savings, and I think we've been doing a good job on the fiscal side, and I hope that the GST will make a difference in increasing government savings, public sector savings, so that we can then increase public investment in infrastructure. But equally importantly, one, on the household side, we really need to work much harder on increasing the opportunities for contractual savings, which is to do with life insurance, pensions, provident funds, etc. Because that serves two purposes. One, that it provides an avenue for savings, for social security, because as we urbanize more, our families are going to be much more nuclear, and so you need that social security for old age. So that's a social good. Second, that if you have higher contractual savings, you have longer term financial savings available for longer term investments, particularly in infrastructure and industry. So I do believe that we have not done enough to incentivize the much faster expansion of pension funds and insurance funds. And finally, that one of the biggest changes that took place in the early 2000s was a huge increase in corporate sector profitability, which actually doubled the private corporate sector investment rate. Now, as a consequence of the twin balance sheet problem that enough has been discussed and talked about, that's a problem. And so, and of course, between the Reserve Bank and the government, they're taking action to resolve that. But that needs to be done much faster. And I've certainly been a votary of a bad bank, which I understand has been considered and decided not a good idea, but I still continue to be a votary of the bad bank, mainly with the objective that what we want to do is to get these bad assets out of the existing banks so that they can get going on lending for new productive activities. It's a very simple-minded idea, but that's sort of the root of my being a votary of a bad bank. And of course, you do everything else with a bad bank in terms of the NCLT, working out the bad assets, etc. And I'm not going into that detail, but I want to just a conceptual issue that you want the existing banks to be rid of the bad assets so that they can be much more proactive in lending, having the ability to lend for productive activities.
Wouldn't a bad bank, sorry, you brought it up, so wouldn't a bad bank be preferable to what we are seeing now with the regulator dictating resolution? I mean, are you comfortable with that?
Let me say both things. One, I don't feel comfortable with that because I feel that it puts too much of a burden on the Reserve Bank. However, as I said, both things. The second is I don't know enough of the detail. I don't know enough of the situation to have a sort of definitive view on that. My sort of fundamentals tell me that it's not such a good idea. But then I always used to say when I was inside that look, a lot of things are not known outside. So I'm willing in some sense to learn and understand why this route has been preferred. But as I said, but this route, the only issue to my mind is that while the workout of assets takes place, the existing banks are still holding these assets, and they're being diverted to doing all the work that is necessary to rework these assets and get them out, and therefore they can't be as active in productive lending as they otherwise would if these were just out of their hair.
Oh, absolutely. Dr. Mohan, thank you for spending the time to speak to us about this book and in the process many other questions that we still have for you. Thank you so much.
Thank you.